Looking for fun ways to use embossing powder on your cards? Well, stay tuned because I have 5 techniques you're going to want to try. Hey crafty friends, it's Christina. Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to share with you 5 techniques that you can use with embossing powders. And if you stick around to the end, I'm going to share with you a bonus technique. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's talk about what we need to work with embossing powders first. So if you've never worked with embossing powders, you're going to need obviously embossing powders. Embossing powders come in so many different forms. You've got ones that are metallic, you have clear, you have white, there's black, there's different colors, there's kinds with glitter inside of it, and there's Tim Holtz's embossing glaze, which is an embossing powder, however it's more translucent. Lots of different varieties of embossing powders. And what you need is, besides your cardstock, you're going to also need a way to stamp or something to use to adhere your embossing powder to your cardstock. You're going to need a heat tool. This is what you're going to need to melt your embossing powder. Mine's by Milwaukee. I've had it for a long time and I do not think this is even available anymore, but I do know there is one, something similar to this. You also need an anti-static pad, or they also come in brushes. So mine is a little bag and inside of it has powder. And if I kind of splat this on top of some cardstock, you'll see it leaves some powder. What this does is it actually takes any kind of static or maybe oils from your fingers that you may have transferred to your cardstock and makes this nice and clean. Because the embossing powder, when you put it down, will stick to just about anything where you don't want it to stick. You're also going to probably want some kind of tweezers or something to hold your embossed piece or your cardstock while you're heat setting. So I have 2 kinds of these reverse tweezers. When you squeeze it together, they open. And I use these especially for smaller pieces of cardstock where you might get too close to your fingers. Most times I'm using a full piece and I can kind of just turn it around and emboss or use the heat gun in different areas without burning my fingers, but you definitely want to have something for when you're doing those small pieces. You're also going to want some sort of brush. I have 2 different types of brushes. This is one for cleaning off bigger areas and this one is for cleaning off little areas. Now these are clean, dry, nothing on them. I use this for when I do get that little bit of embossing powder someplace where I don't want it. I have a tool to get kind of close to my stamped image or whatever I put down on my paper to kind of wipe away that pieces I don't want. I also like to have a bigger one in case I forget to use my embossing pad and I have a big area that needs to be cleaned. So I have a larger one too. And then the last thing you're going to want to have on hand, some people use coffee filters, but you need something for funneling your embossing powders back into your containers. All I do is just take a piece of copy paper and fold it in half, and that gives me my funnel for pouring my leftover embossing powder back into its containers. All right, that is everything. We are going to hop into our very first little project here. For my first one, I'm going to be using Kraft cardstock. I love using Kraft cardstock with white embossing powder. I just think it's a very nice soft look. And we're going to start off by putting down our powder bag so that when we do our embossing powder only sticks to our ink. I have a foam mounted stamp on the side over here. So I took out my MISTI pad and I just have my foam mounted stamp. And I'm going to ink this up using my Versamark ink. We want to make sure we get this nice and stamped down really well. And I really love this stamp. It's just the prettiest stamp. So we ink that up really well. And then we are going to go ahead and close our cover here and make sure we get a good transfer. I'm going to set my stamper aside. I'm going to bring out my piece of white copy paper and I'm going to use white embossing powder, and I just really love how this looks on Kraft cardstock. I just think it comes out so pretty. And make sure everything's nice and covered. Sprinkle away. May have to use like almost the whole container here. And this is just an ultra fine embossing powder, so it just means it's a smaller grain. And I just find it really nice with the detail, especially with very thin images like this one. I'm going to use my paper just to funnel my embossing powder back into my jar. So I'm going to go ahead and melt my embossing powder, and I'll zoom in so you can see how it reacts. I am going to heat this up for a few seconds before I start embossing, just to make sure it's nice and embossed. It helps keep my paper from warping too much. So we're going to go ahead and heat set this. Whenever I heat emboss right after I'm done, I always like to kind of roll the cardstock a little bit just to make sure that we lay nice and flat. So I'm going to show you a couple of different ways I like to color in the images, and I'm going to first start off with showing you some pencil. So I'm just going to take this green colored pencil, and if I wanted to, I can definitely come in and do some pretty shading as well. But for this, I am just going to do just a plain old fill of the color. And I love how you can kind of see the texture of the Kraft cardstock through the colored pencil as you lay down the color. So I'm going to do a little bit of how you can build your color so you can add some shading. So this is my lightest color, and I kind of have 3 colors of pink here. I'm starting with my lightest color, and I'm filling in the entire image. I'm not trying not to be heavy-handed with my color. I'm just giving a light fill. So I am just going to get that down. And then I'm going to come in with my medium color. And I am going to just kind of start maybe about 1/3 of the way up from that section that I'm doing. So right in this section right here, I'm just going about 1/3 of the way up, laying that color. So you can even just draw yourself a little line so you know where that area is. And we're just going to go ahead and fill in that color. And then I'm going to come in with my darker one. And from there, I'm just going to kind of lay some color down at the bottom. I don't want this dark color to overpower too much. So I'm just laying that down. And then I'll come in with my medium color. Similar to like if you're familiar with Copic markers, you want to build from your lightest to your darkest color and shading out as you go. So with my lighter color, and then I'll shade this or pull the color out from here as well. And I just feel like this gives such a pretty look to flowers on Kraft cardstock. I just think that comes out so pretty. And there you go. So we have that really cute, pretty colored pencil flower. I just think that's really pretty. Another option for coloring in your stamped images on Kraft cardstock, and you could do this with white cardstock as well. I just love the look of Kraft cardstock, is to use your alcohol-based markers. So I'm going to use the lightest color. I have tested this out. This middle color is definitely too dark. This is the TriBlend markers. I'm going to go with the lightest color. The darker colors or the middle and the end are just too dark. And we're going to go ahead and color in. I'm not going to do any shading on this. I am just going straight from the marker to the colored images. Now, just one thing to be careful is that you are going over embossing powder with your alcohol markers, and just be light touched because you don't want to kind of shred the end of your alcohol marker, the brush tip of your marker if you're using brush tips. So I just went light touch, and I really like how that turns out. Same thing with the darker color. For this one, or for a flower, you can definitely go from the lightest to the darkest. And I really like how this looks. But when you first lay it down, you think, this is not going to work because of the color. So this is the lightest color of pink. And you see how dark that shows up when you color. But as it dries, you can start to see the pink. And you'll probably see the pink as I'm coloring. So I'm going to lay down all of my lightest color on all parts of this flower. So you can see where the first part I did right here is starting to dry, and the second part, or the last part that I just colored, is a little darker. So it just takes a second or two for it to kind of absorb into the paper. Again, you can do some shading with this as well. So I'm going to come in with my lighter color, or my mid-tone color, my medium color. And we can create some pretty shadows with this as well. And one thing you do have to watch for is if you want to be careful with going over your embossing powder, because alcohol ink will definitely stain and stick to the embossing powder. So just be careful when you're doing that one. And my last favorite way is with my Zig Clean Color Real Brush markers. With this one, it lays down the same way. You're going to end up with darker as you're putting it down, so you think, oh, this color is just way too dark, or too brown colored. But as it dries, it starts to turn a little bit of a pinker color. And with this, I found this particular, at least this color, that I can immediately go in and just start adding another layer on top to add some additional shading. This is a water brush marker, so you would actually add water to this, but I like just the look that you go in and add the color and not do any kind of blending. Same thing with the green, so we'll just go ahead and do the leaves here. So you can get some really pretty effects with the different types. I did go ahead and stamp this image out and do each one of those techniques with the embossing powder. So this one right here is done with the alcohol-based markers. This one is done with the Zig markers. So you can kind of see the Zig, it does fade a little bit more into the pink. That's the alcohol-based markers, and then this is the colored pencils. You can use any markers with this. If you have Tombos, you can use those. But the colored pencils, I think, is probably my favorite look with the Kraft Cardstock and embossing powder. This next one is kind of similar to the last one we just did. We're going to use white cardstock and our same stamped image. I'm just going to stick that right in here, and then we'll ink up our stamp with our Versamark and then heat set it with our embossing powder. Don't forget to use your anti-static just to kind of take away any of your oils or the static from the cardstock. And then we'll go ahead and stamp this out. All right, so we have that all heated up and done. So I'm gonna do my little roll to help kind of flatten out the cardstock a little bit. And for this one, we're gonna play with our Distress Oxides. You can use any types of ink with this. I'm gonna use the Distress Oxide. I've pulled in a couple of my brushes here, and then I also pulled in some finger daubers. I'm gonna start with the finger daubers. And this is one that is just kind of free form. You don't worry about it being within the lines of the embossing powder. You're just going to use this to kind of create this pretty kind of abstract, I guess you could say, background. And as you color over it, you can see that white embossing powder start to pop. So I'm going to do all of these pretty flowers with the Victorian Velvet Distress Oxide. And I'm even getting some of this Victorian Velvet onto the leaves, but I am totally fine with that. And now I'm going to take my shabby shutters, and I'm going to especially do these bigger leaves right here with the shabby shutters. You can use a darker color or whatever color that you like. And since my branches I have these thin branches that come off to the side, I think I'm going to leave those for right now and then come back in and get those at the end. I'm going to take my pumice stone, and I am going to use that as my vase, but I'm also going to use it to create an entire background. So I'm just going to come in here with my pumice stone onto my vase. Again, I am not worrying if I am going over any of the areas that I've already inked, and I'm not worried if I'm staying within embossing powder. I am using this more just to pull that color, the white embossing powder, out from underneath the ink. Okay, so there we go. We have our pumice stone down. I went from a little darker at the bottom to a lighter look at the top. However, I think I want to add a little bit more up at the top here. And then I'm going to go ahead and we'll close up our pumice stone so I don't accidentally try to use it. I'm going to take my green again, and I am going to come into these leaves and do a light shading of these as well. could just kind of dab it off onto the side of your piece of like cardstock or paper, but it's just a very simple technique. We're going to come in with pumice stone. I'm going to dab some of this off because I want to color in these little branch pieces. That pink color, this one I already kind of did in green, but you can do, you know, whatever you want with this. This is the fun thing about it. And then you're going to take your pumice stone and you can come back in just with your, what's the ink that's on here, and just kind of blend out some of that color so it's not quite as harsh on those. So I just think this is a fun technique. It's kind of like trying to spotlight the embossing powder. And the last thing you want to do is just take a piece of paper toweling and go over that embossing powder, the embossed areas, and it'll pull up any of the extra ink onto your paper toweling and make that embossing powder kind of stand out a little bit more. Isn't that pretty? I just find that to be a fun background. You can definitely die cut around this if you had a die that matched this. You could fussy cut around it. You could do just a stitched border die around it. I just think this comes out so fun. So for this next technique, we don't need Versamark ink, but we are going to use embossing paste instead. So I have this translucent, it could be white, it could be translucent, it doesn't really matter. And then we have our embossing powder. I'm going to start off with my embossing buddy. This is what it's called. This is an embossing buddy that has our powder in it. And then I'm going to take my stencil. This is called Dandelion, and I'm going to put it right over the top of my cardstock and then come in with my embossing paste. Like I said, this is just a translucent paste, and we're going to go ahead and just put, I'm not going to be, you know, too technical or making sure that I cover the whole thing. It's just so I could show you how this is done. So I'm just going to go ahead and smear this on and put a nice thin coat of our embossing paste on here. And then when we peel this back, we'll have our pretty dandelion design there. So I'm going to go ahead and clean these things off because you want to make sure that when you're using embossing paste that you clean off your tools right away. Otherwise it'll harden on there and you will never get it off. So here's one that I did with more of a detailed background. So I filled up almost the whole cardstock, and I am going to go ahead and add my embossing powder. This is just a Ranger embossing powder. It's called Marigold, and we're going to go ahead and sprinkle that on. You want to make sure you do this before your embossing paste dries so that it has something to stick to. So we're going to be filling up this background pretty good, making sure it's all nice and covered. And then we can just tap off our extra onto our piece of paper and see how pretty that is. And then once we have that all done, we can take our heat gun, and I love what happens. The embossing powder and the embossing paste start to bubble together, and I just love the way that looks. All right, there we go. I really love the way it turns out, especially because of the embossing paste. It's raised up off of the cardstock a little bit, and then as you heat it up, it kind of reacts with the embossing paste and bubbles a little bit. I really love that kind of design. This marigold color with the translucent paste gives a pretty shine to it as well. So this next one is a simple and fun one. I just die cut a sentiment. So this is a thanks sentiment that I die cut with a thank you die set. And I layered it probably about 3 times. There's about 3 layers of cardstock on here. I just glued each layer together. And what I'm going to do is just take my Versamark ink, and I am going to stamp some Versamark ink using right from the pad onto my die cut piece. And I'm not going to stamp the whole thing. You can if you want to, but I'm only going to go about halfway up. We just want to make sure that we're getting that ink all over. And one thing I did forget to do is I forgot to add my embossing powder, or my little bag here. So I'm going to try to sneakily come in here and add that powder just to the top parts here. So hopefully that my embossing powder won't stick to anywhere but just onto my Versamark ink. And this is where having a tweezers comes in handy. So I'm just going to take my tweezers, grab onto my sentiment, and I'm going to switch out my cardstock since that one has Versamark on it, and bring in my other one that I've been using. And I'm going to take some embossing powder. This is called Navy, and I'm just going to sprinkle that right onto my sentiment. We're going to tap off the excess, and then we can go ahead and heat set this. Again, having the tweezers is handy, especially when you're using the hot tool. So there we go. There is our Thanks sentiment, half embossed. So you could take just about any die cut and make an embossed look to it, or give it embossing powder. You pull out that gold and silver embossing powders, do die cut some frames. You can make some nice metallic mirrored cardstock of your own. If you don't have mirrored cardstock, you can even use it on the edge of a piece of cardstock if you wanted to give just a little gold background matte layer onto your cardstock. You can use your metallic embossing powder. So I just think this is fun, very simple, just to have just like a half embossed sentiment that you can add to a card front. For a last embossing project, I pulled out a foam mounted rubber stamp. This is a background stamp, and I have a piece of white cardstock. I'm just adding some Versamark ink to my background stamp here. Now I am going to go ahead and stamp this out onto my cardstock. So I pulled out a fresh piece of my paper. I have my cardstock all inked up with my Versamark ink in my background stamp, and I pulled out a couple of different colors of my Distress Oxide inks. For this, I am going to do this in stages. So I'm going to start off with one color and sprinkle it onto sections of my card. So I'm just kind of pouring that on at a little bit of an angle here, and then tapping it off. And then I could take this powder and pour it back into my container. And then I'm going to take another color. So this is just pink color. It's Kitsch Flamingo, which is one of the newer colors. I'm going to sprinkle that on. Tap off our excess. And then we're going to take our green embossing powder. So this is peeled paint. And we're going to go ahead and sprinkle that on. So you can create some really fun, colorful backgrounds by doing this in different layers. You can add, you can even sprinkle and combine colors so you have like a little mix throughout. But this one I just did in sections. Just tap off the excess and we'll pour our extra before we heat emboss. And then we'll go ahead and heat set this with our heat gun. So there we go. There's our nice colorful kind of rainbow, sort of rainbow background. You can even take this and color these in just like we did with our first technique in the Kraft cardstock. Colored in with your colored pencils. You can do your Distress Oxide inks and blend in color. You can even do a lighter color of the, you know, if you have the Kitsch Flamingo, you can do that, and then you can do a lighter shade of pink to go on there. So there's many different things you could do with this. Die cut it for a cute background. And now for our bonus project. So not only have we talked about different ways we can use our embossing powders, but we talked about different types of mediums. So instead of just using Versamark, you can use your embossing paste. But for this technique, we're going to use our double-sided tape. I have a really thin double-sided tape. That's this one. I think this is an 1/8 inch, and then this is a 1/2 inch double-sided tape. We are going to create some fun backgrounds. So I am going to go ahead and add my powder to my cardstock, and we are going to find the end of our double-sided tape, and we can actually create some stripes going down our cardstock. Now, probably I'm not going to be perfectly lined up, but we'll be pretty close. We just need to make sure that our tape does not wrinkle. Let me grab my scissors. We'll just cut off the end here, and we can rotate between different types of tape. So I have about a 1/2 inch tape. I'm going to come in with my little tiny thin, I think it's an 1/8 of an inch tape here. We can do that. We can go back into our thicker tape. We can even add two rows to that. So we're just gonna do two of the thicker and one of the thinner. And we're going to cut those ends off. So for this one, I'm going to use 2 different color embossing powders. So for this one, I think my thin one I'm going to do in one color, and then my thicker tape I'm going to do in a different color. So I am going to peel the backing off of my thin one. Just like so. And then I'm going to add my piece of paper here. And we are going to select, I have my gold and my silver. I think I'm going to put a silver stripe going right down the center. I'm going to go ahead and just sprinkle that on. And then we'll put our extra powder back inside of our container. And then we can go ahead and take off the tape for our thicker pieces of cardstock. So we're just going to go ahead and pick that off with our tweezers here. Just going to peel that off. Then I'll bring in my paper here. I've got embossing powder everywhere. I'm going to bring in my paper, and we are going to then go ahead and add our gold embossing powder. We can go right over the top of the silver because it's already got the silver on there. Just make sure our tape is all covered. And then I'm going to go ahead and heat set this. So that creates us such really nice stripes. So now what we could do is even go back in and add additional stripes. So I'm going to go over this again with my thicker and thinner tape. And again, I'm just going to go ahead and pull off the thinner tape and do the silver embossing powder with that. I am going to take this brush and kind of wipe off my tape with the silver just to help prevent it, because that last one I got it everywhere. Okay, we'll just wipe that off. And then we'll pull off our wider tape. And then we could add our gold embossing powder to the thicker one. So there we go. Create nice little fun background using double-sided tape. I hope you enjoyed today's video and found it helpful. Maybe you learned a new technique, or you are reminded of one that you've tried in the past and forgot about. On the screen, you'll find a playlist for our Card Making for Beginners series videos. In here, you'll find all different types of technique videos and how to get started with card making. Thanks everybody for watching.